Charlotte Vane grabbed Laura's water glass off the plaintiff's table, slammed it down in front of her own seat, and laughed. Loud, open, shameless, as Laura Cross crumpled sideways in her chair and hit the courtroom floor. The gallery erupted. Bailiffs rushed forward, and Charlotte stood over the unconscious woman she had helped poison, smoothing her dress with both hands, smiling at Derek like they had already won. She had no idea that the small digital recorder sitting inside Sylvio Reed's manila envelope was about to rip her entire world apart, in front of every camera in that room. Drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this story travels. If you're new here, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The morning of the trial, Laura Cross woke up at 4:47 in the morning and sat on the edge of the hotel bed for 22 minutes without moving. She didn't pray. She didn't cry. She'd done enough of both over the past 14 months to last several lifetimes. She simply sat there, breathing, counting each inhale, each exhale, the way her therapist had taught her when the world felt like it was collapsing in from all sides. And for 14 months, the world had been doing exactly that. She looked at her hands in the low light from the window. They were steadier than she expected. That surprised her. 3 weeks ago, those same hands had shaken so badly that she spilled coffee all over the deposition papers Sylvio Reed had laid out on her kitchen table. He looked at her then, not with pity, though she had half expected it, but with something closer to recognition, like he understood what it meant to hold yourself together with nothing but stubbornness and the knowledge that the truth was on your side. The truth is a weapon, Laura, Sylvio had told her that evening, carefully blotting the coffee from the documents with paper towels, but only if you're patient enough to let it fire at the right moment. She had held on to those words like a lifeline. Now she stood, moved to the window, and looked out at the gray Chicago morning. Somewhere across this city, Derek was waking up too, probably in the apartment he now shared openly with Charlotte Vane, the apartment that Laura had indirectly paid for, funded by the quarterly dividends from the company she had spent 19 years building. She thought about that for a moment, then pushed it down. Anger was not useful today. Today required something colder, something precise. She dressed carefully. Navy blazer, cream blouse, minimal jewelry. No heels. She wanted to feel the ground beneath her feet. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time, studying the face that had stared back at her from Forbes magazine covers, from boardroom presentations, from charity galas where she and Derek had stood side by side, smiling for photographers. She looked older now, harder around the eyes. But there was something else in her expression, something that hadn't been there before all of this started. A quiet, absolute certainty. She picked up her phone and sent Sylvio one text. It read, "I'm ready." His response came back in under a minute. "So is everything else. See you at 8. She put the phone in her jacket pocket, grabbed her bag, and walked out the door. The courthouse steps were already crowded when her car pulled up. Reporters, photographers, a handful of protesters holding signs that Laura didn't bother to read. The case had attracted significant media attention. Not surprising, given that Laura Cross was something of a public figure in Chicago's business community, and the allegations being leveled against her were the kind that destroyed reputations before a single piece of evidence was ever examined. Derek's legal team had been extraordinarily effective at managing the press narrative in the months leading up to today. They had fed stories to journalists, carefully worded quotes about Laura's erratic behavior, her troubling dependence on alcohol, her supposed paranoid delusions about a husband who had, allegedly, done nothing but try to support her through a difficult period. The stories had landed. Laura had watched her professional reputation fracture in real time. Board members growing distant, partnerships quietly dissolving, 2 major clients citing concerns about leadership stability in their termination letters. Derek's team had been surgical about it, methodical, which, in retrospect, should not have surprised her. She had always known her husband was intelligent. She had simply never imagined he would turn that intelligence against her. She stepped out of the car and walked up the courthouse steps without looking at the cameras. Inside, the hallway outside courtroom 14 was already buzzing. Laura spotted Sylvio immediately. Tall, 50s, wearing the dark charcoal suit he reserved for trial days, his silver hair pushed back from his forehead, a leather briefcase in one hand, and a paper coffee cup in the other. Beside him stood his paralegal, a young woman named Dina, who had the kind of organizational precision that Laura deeply respected. Sylvio saw her coming and stepped forward. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been waiting 14 months for this morning," Laura said. "Good." He handed her the coffee cup. "You look composed. That matters. The jury is going to watch your face all day, and Derek's team is going to try to rattle you. Every single thing that happens in that room today, I need you to stay exactly as composed as you are right now." "I know. Even when it's hard." She met his eyes. "Especially then." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, let's go in." They pushed through the heavy doors into courtroom 14, and Laura felt the room shift the moment she walked in. Heads turned. Whispers moved through the gallery like a current. She kept her gaze level and moved to the plaintiff's table without acknowledging anyone. Then she saw Derek. He was already seated at the defendant's table across the aisle, his own attorneys arranged around him. He was wearing a charcoal suit, coincidentally the same shade as Sylvio's, though the tailoring on Derek's was considerably more expensive. And his hair was neat, his posture relaxed, his expression carefully calibrated to communicate the patient weariness of a man who had been unfairly dragged into a courtroom by a troubled ex-wife. He didn't look at her, which was worse, somehow, than if he had. And then, 3 feet to his right, Laura saw Charlotte Vane. Charlotte was 29 years old. She had joined Cross Analytics, Laura's firm, as an intern 2.5 years ago, fresh from graduate school, bright and ambitious, and exactly the kind of young talent that Laura had made a point of recruiting. She had been good at her job. Laura had liked her, in the distracted way that senior executives sometimes like promising subordinates. Aware of their potential, pleased by their performance, never quite seeing them as fully real. That blindness had cost her everything. Charlotte was dressed conservatively today, a pale gray dress, her dark hair pulled back, minimal makeup. She looked almost demure. Laura recognized the costume for what it was. Charlotte Vane was performing innocence, and she was doing it well. But when Charlotte's eyes found Laura's across the room, just for a fraction of a second before she looked away, Laura saw the real thing underneath, the calculation, the confidence, the absolute certainty that she had won. And then Charlotte leaned toward Derek and said something quietly, and they both smiled. Laura sat down, placed her hands flat on the table in front of her, and breathed. "Don't react," Sylvio murmured beside her. "I'm not." "Good, because they're watching you." She knew they were. The entire room was watching her. That was fine. Let them watch. By the end of today, everyone in this room was going to understand exactly what had happened to Laura Cross and exactly who was responsible. Judge Anita Moore entered the courtroom at 9:02, and the room rose and settled in the practiced rhythm of these proceedings. Judge Moore was in her early 60s, with the kind of face that had heard too many lies to be easily moved by anything. She had a reputation for cutting through theatrics and getting to substance, which was exactly what Sylvio had told Laura when he'd first learned she would be presiding. "Moore is ideal for us," he'd said then. "She doesn't like games. Derek's team likes games." Opening statements began at 9:15. Derek's lead attorney was a man named Foster Hale, expensive, polished, the kind of lawyer whose suits were tailored to telegraph authority. He stood before the jury with the practiced ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times. And he began to speak, and what came out of his mouth was so smooth and so plausible that Laura had to remind herself she was the one who knew the truth. Hale told the jury about a troubled marriage. He told them about a brilliant businesswoman who had, over the course of several years, developed a serious problem with alcohol, documented, he noted, by no fewer than 3 medical professionals. He talked about the increasing instability of Laura's behavior, her paranoia, her tendency to interpret innocent events as evidence of persecution. He described Derek Cross as a devoted husband who had tried, repeatedly and at great personal cost, to get his wife the help she needed, only to find himself the target of her delusions when the marriage finally collapsed. He spoke Charlotte Vane's name with delicate care, as though she were a blameless young woman caught in the crossfire of a troubled woman's obsession. He was very, very good. And he was lying about almost everything. Laura kept her hands flat on the table. She kept her breathing even. She looked at the jury, 12 people, assorted, tired-looking, doing their civic duty, and she wondered what they were thinking, whether Hale's opening was landing, whether they were looking at her and seeing what he wanted them to see. Then Sylvio stood up. He didn't have Hale's polish. What he had was different, a quality of utter groundedness, like a man who had no interest in performance and every interest in truth. He walked to the center of the room, looked at the jury for a moment without speaking, and then said quietly, "My client didn't come here today to ask you to feel sorry for her." The room was very still. Laura Cross spent 19 years building a company from a 2-person startup operating out of a spare bedroom into one of the most respected data analytics firms in the Midwest. She doesn't need your sympathy. What she needs is for you to listen, carefully, and all the way to the end. Because what you are going to hear in this courtroom over the coming days is going to challenge everything you just heard from opposing counsel. He paused. Let the silence do its work. You're going to hear about a conspiracy, not a paranoid delusion, not a story invented by a troubled woman, an actual, documented, recorded conspiracy by 2 people to undermine and destroy Laura Cross's health, her professional reputation, and ultimately her life, in order to gain control of the assets she spent 2 decades creating. He glanced briefly toward the defendants' table. And you're going to hear it in their own words. Laura heard the gallery stir. She kept her eyes on the jury. Foster Hale made an objection. Premature disclosure, he argued, editorializing in opening statements. Judge Moore sustained it, which was the procedurally correct thing to do, but the words were already out there, already in the air, already sitting in the minds of every person in the room. Sylvio returned to his table with the equanimity of a man who had anticipated exactly this and had gotten exactly what he wanted out of the exchange. He sat down beside Laura and opened his legal pad. "First blood," he murmured, so quietly that only she could hear it. She said nothing, but she felt something shift in her chest, something that had been locked tight for 14 months, beginning, very slowly, to loosen. The first witness of the morning was Dr. Paul Sheridan, a physician who had treated Laura approximately 18 months ago, during a period when she had been, genuinely, consuming more alcohol than was healthy. This was the part of the story that was true, and Laura had made peace with that truth a long time ago. She had been struggling. She had been drinking too much. She had been under an extraordinary amount of stress, though she had not known at the time that the source of that stress was being manufactured and intensified by the 2 people closest to her. Hale walked Sheridan through his testimony with the practiced gentleness of a man handling expensive china, drawing out piece by piece the clinical picture of a woman in psychological distress. Sheridan was not unkind. He was simply honest about what he had observed, and what he had observed, in isolation, did look bad for Laura. Laura watched the jury as Sheridan spoke. She watched a woman in the front row, middle-aged, sensible-looking, frowning slightly as Sheridan described Laura's elevated anxiety levels and her admission of daily alcohol consumption. She watched a man in the back row fold his arms. This was the low point. Sylvio had prepared her for it. "They go first," he'd said, "because they want to set the frame. They want you to already look damaged before we say a single word on your behalf. You need to sit through that without falling apart, because the moment you fall apart, you prove their narrative." She didn't fall apart. When Sylvio rose for cross-examination, his approach was surgical. He asked Sheridan about the timeline of Laura's symptoms. He asked whether Sheridan had been aware of any external stressors in Laura's life during the period he treated her. Sheridan acknowledged there had been some reported stress related to her marriage. Sylvio asked whether Sheridan had ever tested Laura for the presence of certain controlled substances, a question that made Hale shoot to his feet with an objection. Sustained. But again, the question was out there. Sheridan was excused. The morning moved forward. The second witness before the lunch recess was a business associate of Derek's named Raymond Kolb, who testified about an incident at a company dinner approximately 2 years ago where Laura had allegedly behaved erratically and embarrassed Derek in front of clients. It was a minor piece of evidence in the grand scheme of the case, but it was the kind of detail that accumulated, brick by brick, into the edifice Hale was trying to build. Laura listened to Kolb describe an evening she remembered differently. She had not been erratic. She had been emotional because that had been the same week she had first discovered, almost by accident, a text message on Derek's phone that had made her blood go cold. She had not confronted him about it yet. She had not known how. She had been, she could admit in hindsight, operating on the edge of something, but the thing that was driving her to the edge was not her own instability. It was the dawning, nauseating realization that her husband was lying to her. She had not known then just how deep the lie went. Kolb left the stand, and Judge Moore called a lunch recess. In the small anteroom adjacent to the courtroom, Sylvio spread documents across a folding table, while Dina brought sandwiches that nobody ate. Laura stood by the narrow window and watched pigeons on the ledge outside. "They're setting up for Derek's testimony after lunch," Sylvio said. "Hale is going to put him on early. He wants Derek's version of events in front of the jury before we get to our evidence." "I know," Laura said. "His testimony is going to be difficult to sit through." She turned from the window. "I know that, too." "Laura," he waited until she looked at him directly, "whatever he says on that stand, whatever version of you he presents, I need you to remember that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because we have the recording. Everything he says today is going to be destroyed by that recording. But if you react, if you show anger, if you cry, if you do anything that gives the jury a reason to think about your emotional state instead of his words, you give Hale exactly what he needs." She held his gaze. "I've been waiting 14 months to be in this room. I can wait 2 more hours." He nodded slowly. "Yes, I believe you can." After a moment, she sat down, picked up one of the sandwiches, and ate it without tasting it. Because she needed to be sharp, because the afternoon was going to require every single thing she had. Derek Cross took the stand at 1:45 in the afternoon, and for the next 2 hours, Laura sat 6 feet away and listened to her husband describe a marriage that bore almost no resemblance to the one she had lived. He was extraordinary on the stand. She had always known he was charming. It was one of the first things that had drawn her to him 23 years ago when they had met at a conference in Boston, and he had made her laugh 3 times in the span of a single conversation. That charm, deployed in a courtroom, was a formidable thing. He was measured, sincere, occasionally pausing with what appeared to be genuine emotion before collecting himself and continuing. He described his concern for Laura, his attempts to support her through what he called a very frightening deterioration. He spoke about the drinking with sorrow. He spoke about the paranoia, her accusations, her surveillance of his phone, her conviction that he was deceiving her, with the pained patience of a man who had endured a great deal. Laura watched the jury. Some of them were leaning toward him. She breathed. Then Hale asked Derek about Charlotte Vane, and Derek's answer was a masterwork of controlled performance. Charlotte, he said, was a colleague, a professional relationship that had become a friendship during a very difficult period in his personal life. He had confided in her, he admitted, perhaps unwisely given the circumstances, because he had needed someone to talk to while his wife's condition deteriorated. He regretted any appearance of impropriety. He cared about Charlotte as a person and had no intention of allowing her to be further harmed by what he described as Laura's obsessive focus on her. Charlotte, from her seat at the defendants' table, nodded almost imperceptibly. Her expression was carefully arranged into something between sadness and quiet dignity. And then Foster Hale said the words that made Laura's stomach drop, even though she had been expecting them. Mr. Cross, have there been moments in your marriage where you feared for your wife's safety, where you believed she might be a danger to herself or to others? The objection from Sylvio was immediate and loud. Judge Moore allowed it over Hale's argument. But the question had been asked. It was in the room. The jury had heard it. And in the half second before the objection, Laura had seen 3 jurors' eyes flick toward her, assessing, evaluating, wondering. She stared straight ahead. She did not move. She did not react. Under the table, hidden from view, her right hand had curled into a fist so tight that her knuckles had gone white. But no one could see that. And by the time Sylvio stood to begin his cross-examination, her hand had opened again, flat on her knee, still and controlled. Sylvio's cross-examination of Derek was a study in patience. He didn't go for blood immediately. He built carefully, methodically, asking Derek to confirm dates, to clarify timelines, to describe in precise detail the sequence of events he had outlined in his direct testimony. Derek answered confidently. He was on familiar ground with his own story, and he navigated it with ease. And then Sylvio asked, "Mr. Cross, when did you first become aware that your wife had installed a recording application on the home network?" The room shifted. Derek's posture changed, almost imperceptibly, but Laura caught it. I wasn't aware that she had done that," Derek said. "You never discussed at any point during your marriage the possibility that private conversations in your home were being recorded?" "No, of course not." Sylvio made a small note on his legal pad. "Thank you, Mr. Cross." He sat down. He asked nothing further, and the absence of the follow-up question was somehow more powerful than any follow-up could have been. Derek returned to his seat looking exactly as he had before, composed, credible, seemingly unrattled. But Laura watched his eyes find Charlotte's for just a fraction of a second. And in that fraction of a second, she saw it, the flicker of something under the composure, something that was not quite confidence anymore. She looked down at the manila envelope on the table in front of Sylvio. It was sealed, plain, unmarked. It contained a small digital recorder, a device no larger than a USB drive, recovered from a drawer in the home she and Derek had shared, where she had placed it 11 months ago on an afternoon when something inside her had finally stopped doubting and started paying attention. She had listened to what was on that recording once, just once, and then she had called Sylvio Reed. Tomorrow, the whole courtroom was going to hear it, and Charlotte Vane's smile would be the last thing she smiled for a very long time. Sylvio leaned close and said very quietly, "Day 1 is done. How are you holding up?" Laura looked at him, and for the first time since she had walked into this building that morning, she allowed herself a small, private expression that was not quite a smile, but was something adjacent to one. "Ask me again tomorrow," she said, "after they hear it." The morning of the second day arrived the way second days in courtrooms always do, heavier than the first, carrying the weight of everything already said and the dread of everything still coming. Laura had slept 4 hours, maybe 5, in the same hotel room, in the same chair by the window, because she couldn't bring herself to lie flat in the bed. Lying flat felt too vulnerable, too exposed. So she sat upright with a blanket across her lap, and she watched the city lights, and she thought about the recording. She had listened to it once. That was all she had allowed herself. Once, sitting on the kitchen floor of the home she no longer lived in, her back against the cabinet under the sink, her knees pulled to her chest, the small device held up to her ear in a hand that would not stop trembling. She had listened to every word. And when it was over, she had sat there for a very long time in the silence, not crying, not moving, just existing inside the knowledge of what she had heard. Then she had called Sylvio Reed. "Get dressed," he had said, without preamble, after she played him 30 seconds of it over the phone. "Don't touch anything in that house. I'm coming to you." That had been 11 months ago. Now she stood outside courtroom 14 at 8:40 in the morning with a paper cup of coffee going cold in her hand. And when Sylvio arrived, he looked at her face and said, Today is the day." "I know," she said. "How do you feel?" She thought about that honestly for a moment, like someone who has been holding their breath underwater for a year and can finally see the surface. He put a hand briefly on her shoulder. "Stay calm when they play it. The jury is going to watch your face during the recording. Don't give them tears. Don't give them anger. Give them stillness. Stillness is the most powerful thing in that room today." "Stillness," she repeated, like a word she was committing to memory. "Let the tape do the work," he said. "That's what it's there for." They went inside. Charlotte arrived 12 minutes later, escorted by her own attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Renata Solis, who had built a career defending people who, in Laura's estimation, rarely deserved defending. Charlotte was dressed again in the performance of innocence, a pale blouse, her hair down today instead of pulled back, which made her look younger and softer. She walked to the defendant's table without looking at Laura, but the set of her jaw communicated something that her downcast eyes tried to deny. Charlotte Vane was still confident, even now, even knowing that something was coming, because she had to know something was coming. Sylvio had made that clear enough in his opening. She still carried herself like a woman who believed she was untouchable. That confidence, Laura thought, was going to be the most satisfying thing in the room to watch dissolve. Derek came in 2 minutes after Charlotte. He and Laura made eye contact for the first time that morning, a collision of gazes across 6 feet of courtroom air. And what Laura saw in his eyes was not guilt, not fear, not any of the things she had sometimes imagined seeing. What she saw was assessment. He was still calculating, still measuring angles and odds. Even now, on the second day of a trial where his own voice was going to testify against him, he was playing the game. She looked away first, not because she was intimidated, because he wasn't worth her attention anymore. Judge Moore entered at 9:03. The room stood, sat, settled. Foster Hale called Charlotte Vane to the stand at 9:11. The gallery leaned forward visibly when Charlotte stood. She moved to the witness stand with deliberate composure, took the oath with her eyes level and her voice steady, and sat down with her hands folded in her lap, the portrait of a composed young woman wrongly accused. Laura had to give her credit. Under other circumstances, the performance would have been impressive. Hale approached her gently, treating her like something breakable, which was itself a performance, designed to signal to the jury that here was a fragile innocent in hostile territory. He began with Charlotte's background, her education, her career trajectory, how she had come to work at Cross Analytics. Charlotte answered in a clear, measured voice, occasionally glancing toward the jury with an expression calibrated to communicate quiet earnestness. Then Hale asked her about Laura. Charlotte said that Laura Cross had been, at first, a wonderful mentor, inspiring, generous with her time, deeply committed to the success of her team. She said this with what appeared to be genuine warmth, and Laura realized the strategy: lead with praise, make the accusation of conspiracy seem even more implausible by establishing first that Charlotte had admired and respected her. A woman who admired her victim made for a more sympathetic defendant. "And when did that professional relationship begin to change?" Hale asked. Charlotte paused. She pressed her lips together in a way that suggested reluctance to speak, as though what she was about to say pained her. "About 18 months ago," she said, "I started noticing that Laura seemed different, distracted. There were moments in meetings where she would lose her train of thought. There was an incident where she accused a junior analyst of stealing files from her office, and the files turned out to be on her own desk the entire time." She shook her head slowly. "I felt sorry for her. I genuinely did." In the gallery, someone coughed. The sound was loud in the quiet room. Laura kept her eyes on the jury. "Were you ever concerned for your own safety?" Hale asked. And there it was, the pivot, the move that transformed Charlotte from witness to victim. Charlotte hesitated, a beautifully timed hesitation, Laura thought, and then said, "Yes, there was a day, about 8 months ago, where Laura came into a conference room where Derek and I were reviewing some reports, and the look on her face—" She stopped, shook her head. "She accused us both of things that weren't true. things that were frightening to hear because they were so far from reality. And the way she looked at me, another pause. I'm not comfortable saying that I was afraid because I don't want to be dramatic about it. But yes, in that moment, I was afraid. Several jurors were watching Charlotte with expressions of concern. Laura felt Sylvio's knee press briefly against hers under the table. A small, steady signal. Don't react. She didn't react. She breathed. She waited. Hale wrapped Charlotte's direct examination at 10:22, and Sylvio Reed rose for cross-examination. He walked toward the witness stand at a pace that was unhurried to the point of being almost leisurely, which had the effect, intentional Laura knew, of making Charlotte wait, making her absorb the silence, making her feel the approach. Ms. Vane, Sylvio said pleasantly, how long have you known Derek Cross? Approximately 2.5 years, Charlotte said, since I began at Cross Analytics. And in those 2.5 years, would you characterize your relationship with him as professional? Yes. Purely professional? A beat. A small one, but it was there. Yes, Charlotte said again. You've never had dinner with him outside of a work context? Occasionally, with groups of colleagues. I'm asking about one-on-one, Ms. Vane, just the two of you. Dinner, for example, at Marcello's on West Randolph Street on the 14th of February of last year? Charlotte's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We may have had a working dinner, yes. Valentine's Day, Sylvio said, almost gently. You had a working dinner with a married man on Valentine's Day. Hale objected, argumentative. Moore sustained it, but the arithmetic was already in every juror's head. Valentine's Day. Working dinner. One-on-one. Sylvio moved on without breaking stride. He walked Charlotte through a series of dates, meetings, calls, text message exchanges that he referenced without yet entering into evidence, building a timeline that told its own story without requiring him to editorialize. Charlotte answered each question carefully, walking a tightrope between admitting facts she couldn't deny and avoiding the conclusions those facts pointed toward. She was good at it, but she was getting tighter. Laura could see it in the set of her shoulders, the almost imperceptible acceleration of her breathing. Then Sylvio said, Ms. Vane, do you have any medical training? The question landed strangely. Charlotte blinked. No, I have a graduate degree in business analytics. No chemistry background? No pharmacology? No, why would... Are you familiar with a compound called scopolamine? The room changed. It was subtle, a collective micro-shift in attention, like 20 people drawing a slightly deeper breath at the same moment. Charlotte's expression did something complicated. She controlled it quickly, but not quickly enough. I've heard of it, she said carefully. In what context? I don't remember specifically. You don't remember. Sylvio made a small note. Thank you, Ms. Vane. Nothing further at this time. He walked back to his table and sat down, and the "at this time" sat in the air of that courtroom like a lit fuse. It was 11:47. During the morning recess, in the hallway outside the courtroom, Laura overheard Charlotte's attorney, Renata Solis, speaking in a low, urgent voice around a corner, words too clipped and compressed to catch in full, but the tone unmistakable. The tone of a lawyer recalibrating, adjusting strategy, managing a client who had just been rattled for the first time. Laura kept walking. She didn't slow down, but she filed it away. After the recess, Sylvio called Dr. Marion Jeffries to the stand. Doctor, Jeffries was a toxicologist with a 20-year career and the kind of credentials that fill a full page of a curriculum vitae, the sort of expert witness whose qualifications are so extensive that opposing counsel rarely challenges them, because the challenge itself reinforces the credibility. Hale made a brief attempt and abandoned it after 2 minutes. Dr. Jeffries testified in the even, precise language of someone who had translated complex science for juries many times. She explained, clearly and without condescension, the properties of scopolamine, a substance derived from certain plants used medically in controlled doses for conditions including motion sickness and postoperative nausea, but also known, in higher doses administered without consent, to cause disorientation, confusion, memory impairment, heightened suggestibility, and in prolonged exposure, symptoms that could easily be mistaken for or deliberately mischaracterized as alcohol dependency and psychological instability. The woman in the front row of the jury box put her hand over her mouth. The man in the back row had uncrossed his arms for the first time in 2 days. Sylvio asked Dr. Jeffries about Laura Cross specifically. Jeffries confirmed that she had reviewed Laura's medical records, the same records that Hale had used to paint the picture of an unstable alcoholic, and had identified a pattern of symptoms that were, in her professional opinion, consistent with prolonged, low-level scopolamine exposure rather than alcohol abuse. She noted the specific pattern of cognitive symptoms, their timing, their character. She noted that Laura's symptoms had improved significantly after she separated from Derek and left the home they shared, which was consistent with removal from an ongoing source of exposure. Is it possible, Sylvio asked, that what was described as psychological deterioration and alcohol dependency could in fact have been the result of a substance being administered to my client without her knowledge? Yes, Dr. Jeffries said. In my professional opinion, it is not only possible, it is the most medically coherent explanation for the pattern of symptoms in the records I reviewed. Foster Hale's cross-examination was vigorous. He challenged her methodology, attacked the absence of a positive toxicology test from the relevant period, pushed back on the assertion that scopolamine exposure could be definitively distinguished from alcohol-related symptoms. Dr. Jeffries absorbed every challenge with the equanimity of someone who has testified in front of hostile attorneys many times and knows that equanimity itself is a form of authority. She did not budge. She qualified where qualification was necessary and held firm where the science was clear. By the time Hale released her, it was 1:53 in the afternoon, and the temperature in the room had changed fundamentally. Laura could feel it, a perceptible shift in the weight of things. The jury was not the same jury that had walked in this morning. Then Sylvio stood and said, "Your Honor, at this time the plaintiff wishes to introduce Exhibit 14 into evidence." Dina brought the manila envelope to the clerk. The clerk opened it. The small digital recorder was logged, labeled, connected to the courtroom's audio system. Judge Moore examined the chain of custody documentation that Sylvio provided. Clean, unbroken, authenticated by a third-party digital forensics firm that had verified the recording's integrity and confirmed it had not been edited or altered in any way. Hale objected on multiple grounds: rapid fire, privacy violation, authentication, relevance. Sylvio addressed each objection in sequence, citing the relevant case law with the patience of a man who had anticipated every one of them and prepared responses months in advance. Judge Moore listened, considered, and overruled each objection in turn. Charlotte's hands, folded on the table in front of her, had gone very still. Derek had stopped looking relaxed. "The court will hear Exhibit 14, Judge Moore said. The room went quiet with a completeness that Laura had never experienced in any other space. Not in boardrooms, not in negotiations, not in any of the high-stakes moments her professional life had generated over 2 decades. This was a different quality of silence. This was the silence of a room full of people who understood that something irreversible was about to happen. Laura looked straight ahead. She breathed. The recording began. The first voice on the recording was Derek's. Laura knew his voice better than she knew her own, had spent 23 years learning its tones and textures, knowing which register meant which mood, which rhythm of speech meant he was performing versus when he was real. The voice that came through the courtroom speakers was the real one, low, unhurried, the voice he used when he thought no one was listening. "She's not going to connect it," Derek said on the recording. "She's too far gone. You've seen her." Then Charlotte's voice, lighter, sharper at the edges. "The dosage needs to stay consistent. If you reduce it now because you're nervous, the symptoms start to stabilize and she'll start putting things together. A silence on the tape. Then Derek. She already asked me about her memory. Last week. She said she was losing time and she was scared. Charlotte. That's exactly what's supposed to happen. That's the point, Derek. She needs to be scared. She needs to look unstable. If she goes to a doctor, which she will, the presentation needs to be clear. Alcoholic deterioration. That's the diagnosis we need documented before we make the next move. The room was absolutely still. Derek on the recording. The board meeting is in 6 weeks. After the proxy vote, her shares transfer to— Don't say it on the phone, Charlotte snapped. We're in the house. There's no— I said don't say it. Another silence. Then Derek, quieter. The lawyer has the documents ready. Once the competency petition goes through, then everything moves fast, Charlotte finished. But she has to be documented first. Medical record, legal record, behavioral record, all three. Once we have all three, the competency filing is airtight and the asset transfer follows automatically. And if she doesn't, she won't, Charlotte said, with a certainty in her voice that was the coldest thing Laura had ever heard. She's not capable of fighting this anymore. You said so yourself. You said 3 weeks ago she could barely get through a meeting. She's disappearing, Derek. We just need to be patient. The recording ended. For 2 full seconds, the courtroom was silent. Then it wasn't. The gallery erupted. Voices, movement, a sound that wasn't quite unified, but was collectively the sound of human beings processing something that had shattered their framework for the last 2 days of testimony. Judge Moore's gavel came down hard. Then again. Then a third time, with real force. Order! I will have order in this courtroom. The noise dropped. Didn't disappear, but dropped. Laura had not moved. She had sat completely still for the duration of the recording and the eruption that followed it, both hands flat on the table in front of her, her breathing even, her face composed. Stillness is the most powerful thing in that room today. She had held on to that. She was still holding it. She looked at the jury. The woman in the front row was not covering her mouth anymore. She was staring at the defendant's table with an expression that required no interpretation. The man in the back row had both feet flat on the floor and his hands in tight fists on his knees. 3 jurors in the middle row were looking directly at Charlotte Vane. Charlotte was not smiling. Charlotte was not performing anything at all anymore. Her face had undergone something that could only be described as a kind of collapse, not dramatic, not the dissolution of a villain in a movie, but something more real and therefore more devastating. The color had drained from her face. The careful arrangement of her expression, the quiet dignity, the practiced innocence, was simply gone, as though the audio had stripped it away like wallpaper. What was underneath was just a person who had been exposed and knew it, and had not yet found a response to that knowledge. Derek was looking at his own attorney. Hale was writing something rapidly on his legal pad, his expression controlled but tight. Whatever he was writing, Laura doubted it was going to help. Sylvio leaned close to her and said very quietly, "Don't celebrate yet." "I know," she said. "Hale is going to try to rehabilitate this. He's going to argue the recording is doctored. He's going to argue context. He's going to argue—" "Sylvio," she looked at him steadily. "I know. We're not done. I know." He held her gaze for a moment, then sat back. "No, we're not done. But that—" he glanced at the audio system, then back at her. "That was the moment." It was 3:19 in the afternoon. Foster Hale requested an immediate recess, citing the need to respond to newly admitted evidence. Judge Moore granted 30 minutes. The courtroom began to breathe again. Movement, voices, the gradual return of ordinary human noise. And in the middle of all of it, Laura sat still. She didn't look at Derek. She didn't look at Charlotte. She looked at nothing in particular, feeling something move through her that she couldn't name precisely. Not triumph, not relief, not vindication, though it contained elements of all three. It was more like the feeling of a clock running down to zero after a very long countdown. The feeling of something that had been coiled for a very long time, finally, irreversibly releasing. In the row behind her, she heard a woman she didn't know say to the person beside her in a low voice full of shaken comprehension, "They poisoned her. They actually poisoned her." Laura closed her eyes for one breath. One breath. Then she opened them again, because it was not over yet, and she needed to see all of it. During the recess, the corridor outside courtroom 14 was electric, with the kind of energy that follows a detonation. Reporters were typing with both thumbs. Two members of the gallery, strangers, were standing by the water fountain talking rapidly to each other in the compressed tones of people who had just witnessed something significant. Laura walked past all of it and went into the anteroom and sat down across from Sylvio. "Hale is going to put Derek back on the stand," Sylvio said, without looking up from his notes. "To do what?" Dina asked. "To explain," Sylvio said, with a precise kind of contempt. "He's going to try to give Derek a chance to provide an explanation for what the jury just heard. Context, misunderstanding, out-of-context fragments. It's all he has left." "Can he make it work?" Laura asked. Sylvio finally looked up. "No," he said simply, "not with that tape. You can't unhear that." He paused. "But he's going to try. And Derek is going to give the performance of his life out there, because it's the only thing he has left. And I need you to be ready for that." Laura said nothing for a moment. She looked at her hands, steady, both of them, steadier than they had been in months. Steadier than they'd been on the kitchen floor 11 months ago, when she'd first heard the recording and understood the full shape of what had been done to her. "I've been ready," she said quietly, "for a long time." Sylvio looked at her, and for the first time in all the months she had known him, she saw something in his expression that wasn't the controlled composure of a professional, but something warmer and more personal, something that looked like respect. "Yes," he said, "I know you have." The recess ended. They went back inside. Derek Cross returned to the witness stand for what Foster Hale would call a clarifying examination, and what every person in the room understood to be something closer to a last stand. Laura sat down at the plaintiff's table and put both hands flat in front of her, and she waited, and she watched, and she was absolutely still. Derek Cross settled into the witness stand for the second time that afternoon with the deliberate calm of a man who had decided, somewhere in the 30 minutes of recess, that he was going to fight. Not retreat, not collapse, fight. Laura could see it in the way he sat, shoulders squared, chin level, hands resting open on his thighs rather than gripped together. He had made a choice. She recognized the posture because she had worn it herself, every single morning for the past 14 months. The difference was that his choice was built on sand, and hers had always been built on truth. Foster Hale approached his own client with the careful energy of a man diffusing something, moving slowly, telegraphing steadiness to the jury. His first question was measured and direct. "Mr. Cross, the jury just heard a recording. I'd like to give you the opportunity to address what was on that recording in your own words. Can you tell the court the context of that conversation?" Derek exhaled slowly, as though the question required him to reach back through something painful. "That conversation," he said, "was taken entirely out of context." The gallery made a sound. Judge Moore didn't need her gavel. One sharp look at the room was sufficient. Derek continued. "Charlotte and I, yes, we were close. I won't pretend otherwise. After years of watching my wife deteriorate, of watching her drink herself into a state where she couldn't recognize reality, yes, I confided in Charlotte. Yes, we discussed Laura's condition. The words you heard on that recording were two people who were frightened about someone they cared about and didn't know how to help her." He paused. "We were not plotting anything. We were desperate." Hale nodded, as though this was entirely believable. "And the reference to medication, to dosage, can you explain that?" Charlotte had done some research, Derek said carefully, on her own, trying to help. There was a period where we considered whether Laura's doctor might be under-medicating her anxiety. We were talking about the possibility of recommending that her physician adjust her prescription. It was audacious. Laura had to acknowledge that. It was the kind of explanation that required a specific kind of nerve, the nerve of someone who has decided that brazenness is the only remaining tool. She watched the jury. A few faces were uncertain, which was exactly what Hale needed. Not belief, just enough doubt to wedge open a crack. Then Sylvio stood up. He didn't rush. He gathered his notes with unhurried hands, buttoned the middle button of his jacket, and walked toward the witness stand at the same unhurried pace he had used all morning. He stopped about 6 feet from Derek and looked at him for a moment without speaking. "Mr. Cross," Sylvio said, "the recording we heard a short while ago, you're describing it as two concerned individuals discussing a prescription adjustment?" "In essence, yes." "In essence," Sylvio repeated. He let the phrase sit in the air for just a moment too long. "Your wife asked about her memory loss on the recording. She said she was scared. And your response to her fear was to maintain the dosage. That's your version of concern?" "That's not, I was speaking hypothetically. You said, and I'm quoting directly," Sylvio said, his voice dropping to a register that was somehow more powerful for being quieter, quote, "She's too far gone. You've seen her. Does that sound like a man speaking hypothetically about adjusting a prescription?" Derek's jaw tightened. "You're taking isolated phrases. Mr. Cross, what is scopolamine typically used for in a non-medical context?" Hale shot to his feet. "Objection. Calls for speculation." Moore looked at Sylvio. Sylvio said calmly that the witness had already claimed specialized knowledge of pharmaceutical discussions with his co-defendant and was therefore competent to answer. Moore allowed it. Derek said he didn't know. "You don't know," Sylvio said, "but Charlotte Vane, who has no medical or chemistry background by her own testimony this morning, somehow knew enough about it to discuss consistent dosing schedules in your home, where your wife was living, with her food and her water." "That's a very dramatic interpretation. Mr. Cross, did you love your wife?" The shift was sudden enough that Derek visibly recalibrated. Yes, of course." "When did that change?" "It didn't." "When did you first have a romantic relationship with Charlotte Vane?" "I told you, it wasn't—" "Mr. Cross." Sylvio's voice was very quiet now, very still. "I'm going to play you a second clip from Exhibit 14. The courtroom went rigid. Hale was on his feet before Sylvio finished the sentence. "Objection! No prior notice of additional clips, foundation, relevance." Sylvio turned to Judge Moore and explained that Exhibit 14 had been admitted in its entirety, that opposing counsel had been provided the full recording in discovery 3 weeks prior, and that the specific clip he intended to play was time-stamped and logged in the exhibit documentation already before the court. Moore looked at Hale. "Mr. Hale, did you receive the full recording in discovery?" A pause that lasted 1 second too long. "We received what was disclosed as Exhibit 14, yes." "Then you have no grounds for surprise." Objection overruled. The second clip was 41 seconds long. In those 41 seconds, the jury heard Derek Cross tell Charlotte Vane that he loved her. The specific words, unmistakable in tone, intimate in context, and heard Charlotte respond that everything they were doing was going to be worth it when it was finally over and they could stop pretending. They heard Derek say he was tired of pretending. They heard Charlotte say, with a laugh in her voice that was nothing like the quiet dignity she had performed on the witness stand, 2 more months, maybe 3. Then it's done and she's gone and everything she built belongs to us. The woman in the front row of the jury had tears in her eyes. Derek Cross had stopped looking like a man who was fighting. Sylvio let the silence after the clip run for exactly 3 seconds before he said, "Nothing further, Mr. Cross," and walked back to his table. It was 4:07 in the afternoon. Judge Moore called a recess until the following morning, citing the hour and the volume of evidence the jury would need time to absorb. The gallery exhaled collectively, like a room that had been holding its breath. Noise returned in a surge. Laura sat completely still at the plaintiff's table until most of the gallery had filed out, and then she put her hands in her lap and looked at the ceiling for a moment and thought about the 41 seconds she had just heard replayed in a courtroom. 2 more months, maybe 3. Then it's done, and she's gone, and everything she built belongs to us. She had heard those words 11 months ago, alone on a kitchen floor. She had heard them again today, in front of 12 jurors and a judge, and 40 people in a gallery, and reporters with recorders and cameras. She had listened to them both times without making a sound. "Laura," Sylvio was standing beside her, "are you all right?" She looked at him and said, "Yeah, I'm all right." And the thing was, she meant it. That evening in the hotel room, she ordered room service for the first time since the trial began. She ate most of it. She sat at the desk by the window, and she made a list. Not of strategy, not of legal considerations, but of things she wanted to do when this was over. Small things mostly. Take a trip to the coast. Call her college friend Nina, who she hadn't spoken to in 2 years because she'd been too ashamed of how far she'd fallen to pick up the phone. Sleep in her own bed. A bed that belonged only to her in a space that no one else had access to, where nothing was being added to her coffee or her food or her water. She wrote the list in a hotel notepad with a pen that had the hotel's name on it, and then she folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket, and she went to bed, and she slept for 6 hours straight. The third day opened at 9:04. Charlotte Vane was recalled to the stand. She looked different from the previous 2 mornings. Not dramatically. She was still carefully dressed, still composed in the surface way that had carried her through the first day. But something underneath had shifted, and it showed in the micro-expressions that flickered across her face when she thought no one was watching closely enough. Laura was watching that closely. She had been watching Charlotte for 2.5 years without fully understanding what she was seeing. She understood it now. Renata Solis conducted Charlotte's re-examination quickly and defensively, trying to re-establish the narrative of concerned friendship, trying to provide context for what the jury had heard, trying to reframe the second clip as words spoken in an emotional moment between 2 people who had convinced themselves that what they were doing was somehow for the right reasons. It was thin. Laura could see in the jury's faces that it was thin. The man in the back row, who had been folding his arms since day 1, was now simply staring at Charlotte with an expression that had moved past skepticism into something harder. Sylvio's cross-examination of Charlotte on the 3rd day was different from his first. On the first day, he had been methodical, building layer by layer the framework that the recording would ultimately fill. Today, he was direct. "Ms. Vane, did you purchase scopolamine at any point in the past 2 years?" Charlotte's eyes cut to Renata Solis for a fraction of a second. "No." "Are you aware that the DEA maintains transaction records for certain controlled substance precursors?" I don't know what the DEA maintains." "Are you aware of a transaction made through an online pharmaceutical supplier registered in Delaware on March 4th of last year in the amount of $212 using a debit card registered to a business entity called Vane Consulting LLC? Charlotte's hands, which had been folded loosely in her lap, went still in a very particular way, the stillness of a person trying not to move because movement might betray something. "I run a small consulting practice," she said carefully. "That entity is used for business expenses." "What kind of consulting does Vane Consulting LLC perform?" "Data analytics, strategy support." "And this particular purchase, $212 from a pharmaceutical supplier, that was a strategy support expense?" Renata Solis objected. Argumentative. More sustained it, but Charlotte's non-answer had been its own answer, and every person in the room knew it. Sylvio moved on. He introduced a new exhibit, phone records, specifically a log of calls between Charlotte Vane and a number registered to a private investigation firm based in the Loop. He asked Charlotte whether she was familiar with the firm. She said she didn't remember. He asked whether she had ever hired a private investigator. She said no. He asked whether someone else might have hired one on her behalf and used her phone to coordinate. The objection from Renata Solis was fast. Speculation, no foundation. Sustained. But the private investigator had been hired. Sylvio didn't belabor it. He simply moved on, leaving the suggestion in the room like a scent. And when Charlotte was excused from the stand for the second time, Laura noticed that her hands were no longer folded in her lap. They were gripping the arms of the witness chair. The next witness Sylvio called was a man named Gerald Park, a forensic accountant with 23 years of experience tracing financial irregularities through corporate structures. He was 52 years old, wore glasses, and had the patient, slightly tired energy of a man who spent most of his professional life explaining complex things to people who didn't fully want to understand them. He was exactly the kind of witness who sounded dry in summary and was devastating in practice. Park walked the jury through the financial architecture that Derek and Charlotte had constructed over the preceding 18 months. The proxy voting mechanisms, the shell entities, the carefully timed asset transfers that had been set in motion contingent on the successful completion of what the documentation called, with bureaucratic euphemism, the management transition. He explained how Laura's incapacitation, legal, medical, or otherwise, would have triggered automatic execution of documents already prepared and waiting, transferring controlling interest in cross-analytics to a holding company whose beneficial owners were, through 2 layers of corporate structure, Derek Cross and Charlotte Vane. The total value of the assets in question was approximately $47 million. The woman in the front row of the jury was no longer covering her mouth. She was writing something on her notepad. Hale's cross-examination of Park was aggressive and technical, challenging methodology, disputing interpretations, attacking the characterization of normal business planning as evidence of conspiracy. Park absorbed the aggression with the equanimity of someone who was very confident in his numbers and knew that confidence was visible to the people watching. After Hale finished, Sylvio asked Park one final question on redirect. Mr. Park, in your 23 years of forensic accounting, have you ever seen a financial structure of this complexity assembled in preparation for a normal, consensual business transition? Park considered the question without hurry. No, he said. Structures like this are assembled when the parties involved anticipate that the transition will be contested. They're built to be executed quickly and to create legal complications that would be difficult to unwind after the fact. They're not the architecture of a legitimate business succession. They're the architecture of a theft. Hale objected to the characterization, Moore sustained it, and instructed the jury to disregard the final word. But Gerald Park had said it. Theft. One word, ruled inadmissible, already embedded in every juror's mind. It was 11:42 in the morning. Sylvio rested the plaintiff's case at 11:58, and the room took a breath that felt like the moment before a wave breaks. During the lunch recess, something happened that no one in the courtroom had anticipated. Laura was in the anteroom with Sylvio and Dina, eating half a sandwich and reviewing notes, when Dina's phone buzzed with a text from a contact in the courthouse. A brief message that made Dina look up with an expression Laura had never seen on her before. "Sylvio," Dina said, and something in her voice made both of them look up immediately. Dina turned the phone so he could read the screen. Sylvio read it, and his expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. He read it twice. "What is it?" Laura asked. Sylvio set the phone down on the table and looked at her with the particular quality of stillness that she had come to associate with moments when he was processing something significant. "Charlotte Vane's attorney just submitted a request to Judge Moore's clerk," he said. "Charlotte wants to make a statement." Laura stared at him. "What kind of statement?" "An allocution." He paused. "She wants to speak to the court directly, outside of examination, outside of her attorney's prepared narrative." The room was very quiet for a moment. "She's going to talk," Dina said softly. "Why?" Laura asked. Sylvio was quiet for another moment. Then, "Because she's 29 years old and she just listened to her own voice describe a poisoning to a room full of jurors, and Derek Cross spent the entire morning looking at his own attorney instead of at her. And I think..." He stopped, chose his words. I think she's sitting in a room somewhere in this building right now, and she's realizing, possibly for the first time, that the man she did all of this for is going to let her take the fall for as much of it as he possibly can. Laura absorbed this. Will Moore allow it, she asked. She has discretion. Given where this trial is, the evidence in, both sides resting, there's a reasonable argument for allowing Charlotte to address the court before closing arguments. He looked at Laura carefully. If she talks, it could help us, significantly. Or it could be another performance. What do you think it is? Sylvio thought about that for a long time. I think, he said slowly, that whatever Charlotte Vane is about to say, it's not going to be a performance. Afternoon session opened at 1:47. Judge Moore looked out at the room with the expression of someone who has absorbed an unexpected variable and integrated it without losing composure. She acknowledged the request that had been submitted during the recess and addressed both legal teams directly. I have reviewed the request from Ms. Vane to address the court, Moore said. Given the unusual nature and gravity of the evidence in this proceeding, and in the interest of a complete record, I am going to allow it. Ms. Vane will be permitted to speak, under oath, for a period not to exceed 15 minutes. Both counsel are advised that this is not an examination and will not be treated as one. Renata Solis was on her feet immediately, objecting to her own client's request, or rather objecting to the terms, pushing back on the lack of attorney consultation, citing privilege. Moore looked at her and said simply, "Your client has the right to speak for herself, counselor." Charlotte Vane stood up. She didn't look at her attorney. She didn't look at Derek. She looked at Judge Moore, and she walked to the witness stand, and she sat down, and she was sworn in a second time. And then she looked out at the courtroom with an expression that was, for the first time in 3 days, not a performance. It was just a face, a young woman's face, tired and stripped of everything it had been wearing. She began to speak. "I want to say something that my attorney is not going to be happy about," Charlotte said, and her voice was different, quieter, without the careful modulation of the previous 2 days. "I want to say it because there's a recording of my voice in this courtroom that tells most of the truth, and I'd rather tell the rest of it myself than have it come out some other way." The room was absolutely silent. Charlotte looked down at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up. "Derek told me Laura was mentally ill. He told me that before I ever agreed to any of this. He told me that she was deteriorating on her own, that the symptoms were hers, that the instability was genuine, that all he wanted was to protect the company they had built together from someone who was becoming a liability." She paused. I believed him. I want to be clear. I'm not saying that excuses anything, but I believed him. And then I fell in love with him. And then I stopped asking questions that I should have kept asking. A sound moved through the gallery. Not words, not quite a gasp, but a collective compression of breath. Charlotte continued. "The scopolamine was his idea. He told me it was a mild compound. He told me the doses were small. He told me it would simply accelerate something that was already happening." Her voice cracked on the word accelerate, and she controlled it immediately, pressing her lips together before continuing. "I knew it was wrong. I knew it the moment he said it, and I agreed anyway." She stopped. "I agreed anyway." Laura was completely still. Derek Cross was staring at Charlotte with an expression that had moved through shock and rage and arrived somewhere that looked like fear. "I'm not asking for anything from this court today," Charlotte said. "I'm not asking for sympathy. The woman sitting over there." She looked at Laura for the first time, directly, fully. "She hired me when she didn't have to. She mentored me when she didn't have to. And I helped someone hurt her for money, and I convinced myself for a long time that it was more complicated than that." Her voice was very steady now, in the way that voices sometimes go steady when they have moved past the point where breaking is still an option. "It wasn't more complicated than that, and I'm sorry." The silence that followed Charlotte Vane's last word was the deepest silence of the entire trial. Judge Moore let it hold for several seconds before she spoke. "Thank you, Ms. Vane," she said, and nothing in her tone was warm, but something in it was human. You may step down. Charlotte stepped down from the stand. She did not look at Derek again. Laura sat at the plaintiff's table and breathed. 1 breath, 2. She looked at the ceiling briefly, at nothing, and then she looked back at the room, at the jury, at the judge, at Sylvio beside her writing something on his legal pad with a hand that was moving very quickly. Then she looked at the chair where Charlotte had been sitting 3 minutes ago. Empty now. She thought about a young woman who had made a catastrophically wrong choice and had just looked her in the eye and said she was sorry. She held that thought for a moment, not to forgive it, not yet, maybe not ever, but to understand it, to see it clearly without the distortion that anger or pain would add. Then she set it aside, because there was still 1 more day of testimony. Derek's final examination was still ahead. Closing arguments were still ahead. The jury had not yet deliberated. The work was not finished, and Laura Cross had not come this far to stop working now. Sylvio finished writing, looked up at her, and said very quietly, "Closing arguments tomorrow morning." "I know," she said. "It's going to be over soon." She looked at him steadily. "Not soon enough," she said, "but soon." That night, Derek Cross did something that nobody expected. He fired Foster Hale. The news reached Sylvio at 9:47 in the evening through a text from a colleague who had contacts inside the Cook County Courthouse Administrative Office. Sylvio read the message twice, set his phone face down on the desk, and then picked it up and read it a 3rd time. Then he called Laura. She answered on the 2nd ring. She had been awake, sitting at the desk in the hotel room with the notepad list she had made the previous evening, reading it again as though it were something she needed to memorize. "Derek discharged Hale tonight," Sylvio said without preamble. A pause. "What?" "He's filed for a continuance, 24 hours. He's claiming he needs time to retain new counsel before closing arguments." Laura set the notepad down. "Can he do that?" "He can request it. Whether Moore grants it is another matter. She's going to hear arguments on the request tomorrow morning at 8:30 before the session begins." He paused. "Laura, I want you to understand what this is. This is not a man trying to improve his legal strategy. It's too late for that. This is a man trying to buy time." "Time for what?" Sylvio was quiet for a moment. "That's the question I've been sitting here trying to answer for the last 20 minutes. She thought about it. About Derek, the man she had shared 23 years with. The man who had learned from her how to read a room, how to find the pressure points in any negotiation, how to identify the exact moment when a situation needed to be disrupted rather than played through. She thought about what she would do in his position if she were the kind of person who operated the way he operated. "He's not just buying time," she said slowly. "He's trying to change the shape of what happens next. He wants closing arguments to land differently than they would right now, when Charlotte's statement is still fresh in every juror's mind." "That's my read," Sylvio said. "If he delays the close by 24 hours, the jury has a night to let Charlotte's statement settle into something more ambiguous in their minds. Right now they're carrying it sharp and immediate. He wants to dull it. Can he? Not if Moore denies the continuance." A pause. "And I'm going to argue hard for denial." Laura looked at the notepad, the list, the trip to the coast, the phone call to Nina, the bed that belonged only to her. "Sylvio," she said. "Yeah, whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know that what you've done in that courtroom over the last 3 days, I don't have words for what that means." A short silence. Then Sylvio said, in a voice that was quieter than his courtroom register, "You gave me the truth to work with. That's not a small thing. Get some sleep." She tried. She managed 4 hours, which felt like a victory. At 8:17 the following morning, Laura was seated in the back row of the gallery, not at the plaintiff's table, because the session was a procedural hearing, and Sylvio had told her she didn't need to sit up front for it. And she watched Foster Hale walk into the courtroom for the last time as Derek Cross's attorney. Hale moved with the tight precision of a man who had been replaced and was processing the indignity of it through control. He sat, said nothing to Derek, and waited. Derek arrived 3 minutes later with a new attorney beside him, a younger man named Conrad Walsh, smooth-faced and fast-talking, the kind of lawyer who made his reputation on procedural maneuvers rather than trial substance. Laura recognized the type. She had negotiated against people like Walsh in boardrooms. They were good at creating complications where none needed to exist. Judge Moore entered at 8:30 exactly. Walsh stood and presented his case for the continuance with impressive speed, citing the disruption of the attorney-client relationship, Derek's right to counsel of his choice, the complexity of the remaining proceedings. He was polished. He had clearly been up most of the night preparing. Sylvio's opposition was 4 sentences long. Your Honor, the plaintiff has been waiting 3 years for justice in this matter. The defense had experienced trial counsel through the presentation of all evidence. The request for continuance at the eve of closing arguments is transparently dilatory. The jury has been seated and sequestered and is ready to hear closings this morning. We ask that the schedule be maintained. Judge Moore looked at Walsh. She looked at Sylvio. She looked at her own notes for about 6 seconds, which felt considerably longer to every person in the room. Request for continuance denied, she said. Closing arguments will proceed as scheduled at 9 o'clock. Conrad Walsh sat down with the smooth expressionlessness of a man who had anticipated this outcome and was already recalculating. Derek stared straight ahead. Laura in the gallery let out one slow breath and rose from her seat to move to the plaintiff's table. She passed within 4 feet of Derek on her way. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him either. She sat down beside Sylvio, and he gave her a brief nod, and she placed her hands flat on the table in front of her, and she waited. It was 8:52 in the morning. The jury filed in at 9:03, and Laura looked at their faces as they took their seats. 3 days of testimony had changed them in ways that were visible if you knew how to look. The woman in the front row had the expression of someone who had made a decision and was carrying it with a kind of quiet resolution. The man in the back row was watching Derek cross with a directness that no longer had anything uncertain in it. A younger juror near the center, a man in his early 30s who had been difficult to read for 3 days, was looking at the floor with a furrowed forehead that suggested he was still processing, still working through something internally. Laura focused on him for a moment. He was the variable. He had been the variable all week. Walsh delivered the defense's closing argument first. He was very good. Laura would give him that. He had had approximately 11 hours to prepare, and he had used them efficiently. He walked the jury through a reframing of the evidence, acknowledging, with apparent candor, that Derek and Charlotte had been in a relationship and had concealed it, that their behavior had been morally wrong, that Laura had been genuinely hurt. He leaned into the concession as a strategic move, using it to establish apparent honesty before pivoting to his core argument, which was that moral wrongdoing and criminal conspiracy were not the same thing. He argued that the recording, however damaging it sounded, was the product of a private conversation between 2 people in an emotionally compromised state, people who used the language of control and calculation because they were frightened, and because fear sometimes sounds like malice from the outside. He was making the argument that a reasonable interpretation existed, that a reasonable person could listen to the tape and hear something other than what the plaintiff's team said it contained. And then he said something that made Laura's blood go cold, not because it frightened her, but because it was exactly as sophisticated as she had feared a last-minute attorney maneuver might be. Ladies and gentlemen, Walsh said, you are going to deliberate on the question of what you heard on that recording, and I want to offer you something to hold in your minds when you do. The plaintiff in this case is a woman of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary capability. She built a $47 million company. She is not a passive victim. She has not been a passive victim at any point in this proceeding. He paused. Ask yourself, not whether the recording sounds damaging, but whether the recording alone, without any other physical evidence, without a positive toxicology result, without a single prescription filled or a single verified purchase authenticated in this courtroom, ask yourself whether the standard of proof has genuinely been met. because doubt is not comfortable, but it is the standard. It was a pivot toward reasonable doubt, and it was well executed. Laura watched the younger juror in the center row. His frown had deepened slightly. Sylvio rose. He didn't go to the center of the room immediately. He stood at the plaintiff's table for a moment, and in that moment, he looked at Laura, just briefly, a glance of no more than a second, and she saw in his face something that she recognized as the expression of a man about to say what he actually believes, which is always more powerful than any prepared performance. Then he walked to the center of the room. "I'm not going to spend much time rebutting what you just heard," Sylvio said, "because I think you know what you heard. You've been in this room for 3 days. You heard the recordings, both of them. You heard a toxicologist tell you that the symptoms documented in Laura Cross's own medical records, the records the defense used to paint her as an unstable alcoholic, are more consistent with chemical poisoning than alcohol abuse. You heard a forensic accountant describe a financial architecture so complex, so deliberately constructed, that it required months of planning and the involvement of multiple legal entities to execute. You heard Charlotte Vane get off this witness stand and look Laura Cross in the face and say the words, "I'm sorry." He paused and let that word sit. The defense wants you to think about reasonable doubt. That's their right and their job, and I respect it. But I want you to think about something else. I want you to think about what it costs a person to sit in this room for 3 days and listen to someone they spent 23 years loving describe them as a liability to be managed and removed. His voice was level and without performance. Laura Cross did not come into this courtroom looking for your sympathy. She came here looking for the truth to be heard. She spent 14 months being described as paranoid and unstable and out of control. And she had the patience and the courage and the absolute steadiness of a person who knew what was true, to wait for this room to hear it. The younger juror was no longer looking at the floor. He was looking at Sylvio. "The recording is not the only evidence," Sylvio continued. "The financial records are evidence. The toxicology expert is evidence. The timeline of Charlotte Vane's pharmaceutical purchase is evidence. The fact that Laura's symptoms improved substantially upon leaving the shared home, evidence. And Charlotte Vane's own words on that stand, not just the recording, but her direct testimony in front of all of you, evidence." He looked at each juror in sequence, unhurriedly. This is not a case of reasonable doubt. This is a case of overwhelming, convergent, multiply sourced evidence pointing in one direction. He stopped. The direction of the truth. He walked back to his table. He sat down. The younger juror exhaled audibly. Laura did not look at the jury again. She looked at the table in front of her. She could feel the room's temperature, its weight, the way it had settled into something very different from where it had started 4 days ago. Judge Moore delivered her instructions to the jury at 11:14. She was methodical and precise, laying out the legal standards, defining the burden of proof, explaining the charges and the civil claims in plain language. She thanked the jury for their service. She sent them to deliberate at 11:41. And then there was nothing to do but wait. The waiting was its own kind of trial. Laura sat in the anteroom with Sylvio and Dina and a second cup of coffee she didn't drink, and they talked about other things because talking about the deliberations themselves was pointless, and everyone in the room knew it. Dina had a sister who was getting married in the spring. Sylvio had a daughter who had just gotten into law school. Laura talked about the coast, the trip she was going to take as soon as this was over, the specific stretch of shoreline in Maine where she had gone with her parents as a child and had never gone back to as an adult because there was always something else, some other obligation, some other meeting. "You should go," Dina said. "I know," Laura said. "I'm going." At 12:58, they ordered lunch from the deli across the street. Laura ate all of hers. At 2:31, Conrad Walsh appeared in the hallway outside the anteroom for a brief, charged moment, walking past with his phone to his ear and his jaw set. And something in his body language told Sylvio something, because Sylvio watched him pass and then said, very quietly, "Something's happening." With the jury? Laura asked. I don't know, but something. He paused. It might be nothing. It was not nothing. At 2:47, the bailiff knocked on the anteroom door and said the jury had a question. Questions from juries were not unusual. They were also rarely simple. Sylvio and Laura returned to the courtroom where Walsh and Derek were already seated, Derek looking at his own hands with the stillness of a man who had been sitting with a bad feeling for several hours and was now watching it solidify. Judge Moore read the jury's question aloud from the card that had been passed to her. The question was, can we request to hear the recording a second time in full, including any portions not played during testimony? The room held its breath. Sylvio's expression remained controlled, but Laura saw his hand close briefly around his pen. This was not a jury looking for doubt. This was a jury going back to the source material because they wanted to be sure of what they already believed they knew. This was a jury that had made a direction and was building the foundation under it. Walsh objected to the playback request on procedural grounds. The exhibit had already been admitted and played in relevant portions, and replaying it would be prejudicial. Moore listened, considered for approximately 10 seconds, and overruled. The exhibit was admitted in full. The jury had the right to review it. The recording was played again, all of it this time, including the portions that had not been played during testimony. There were 7 additional minutes of audio from later in the same conversation, recorded after Charlotte and Derek had believed the subject closed. In those 7 minutes, Derek Cross discussed, in specific, practical terms, the timeline for Laura's competency petition and what he described as the hospitalization option, a contingency plan in which Laura's apparent deterioration would be used to have her involuntarily committed, removing her from the company's governance structure entirely while the asset transfer was completed. 7 minutes. Clinical, deliberate, unmistakable. Charlotte Vane's attorney was on her feet. Derek's attorney was on his feet. The gallery was not quiet. Judge Moore's gavel came down 3 times before the room settled enough for her to be heard. In the witness area, the jury, who had requested the playback and were now hearing the additional material for the first time in full context, sat in a silence that had its own specific gravity. The woman in the front row was not writing on her notepad. She had put her pen down. Laura had not known about the additional 7 minutes. She had listened to the recording once, 11 months ago, and had stopped it after the portion she had played for Sylvio because she had heard enough, she had thought. She had not made it to the end. She had not known about the hospitalization option. She had not known that Derek had planned not just to take what she had built, but to remove her from the world while he did it. She sat with that knowledge for a moment. Sylvio, beside her, was very still. Then he placed his hand on the table between them, not touching her, just there, a presence, and she understood it as the gesture it was, an acknowledgement, not pity, acknowledgement. She breathed. The jury was returned to deliberations at 3:59. At 5:22, they came back. Laura was in the anteroom when the knock came. She'd been standing by the window, not looking out, just standing, resting her forehead against the cool glass for a moment because she needed something solid to lean against that wasn't another person. When Dina knocked and said, "They're back," Laura straightened, turned, and said nothing. She walked back into courtroom 14 for the last time. Derek was already at the defendant's table when she entered. She walked past him and sat down, and she did not look at his face, but in her peripheral vision she saw that he was very pale, paler than she had ever seen him. 23 years of knowing someone's color in different kinds of light, and she had never seen it quite like that. The jury filed in. The foreperson was the woman from the front row. Laura had sensed this coming, the way the woman had carried herself through the last day and a half, the particular resolution in her posture. She stood when Judge Moore addressed her, and she held the folded verdict form with both hands. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Moore asked. "We have, Your Honor." "Please read the verdict." The woman unfolded the form. She looked at it, she looked up at the courtroom, and then she read. On the claim of civil conspiracy to commit fraud, the jury found for the plaintiff. On the claim of intentional infliction of emotional distress, the jury found for the plaintiff. On the claim of financial fraud and attempted wrongful transfer of assets, the jury found for the plaintiff. On the punitive damages question, which required a finding of malice, which required the jury to have concluded that Derek and Charlotte had acted with deliberate intent to harm, the jury found yes. Yes. The word the foreperson used was yes, and it was the most ordinary word in the English language, and Laura felt it in her sternum like a physical impact. The gallery erupted. Judge Moore's gavel was sustained and loud, and it took longer than usual to bring the room back. In the space of the noise, Laura looked straight ahead, and she breathed, and she felt something happening in her chest that she couldn't entirely control. Not a collapse, not a breakdown, but a release, deep and structural, like something that had been load-bearing for 14 months finally, at last, handing the weight off. Derek Cross said something to Conrad Walsh in a low, urgent voice. Walsh responded without looking at him. Charlotte Vane, across the room, sat with her hands in her lap and her head slightly bowed and said nothing. She looked like someone who had already said everything she had to say. Judge Moore quieted the room and proceeded through the formalities, acknowledging the verdict, addressing the question of sentencing, which would be a separate proceeding, addressing the civil damages question, which would require a subsequent hearing to quantify. She thanked the jury. She released them. Then she looked at the defendant's table and she said, in the tone of a woman who has seen many things and is not easily surprised by any of them, both defendants will remain available to this court. Counsel will ensure their clients are aware that given the severity of the findings and the criminal referral that this court intends to make to the district attorney's office, travel restrictions will apply pending further proceedings. A criminal referral. Walsh was on his feet immediately. Moore silenced him with a look. Laura sat at the plaintiff's table and thought about the phrase criminal referral and what it meant. Not in the legal sense, because she understood the legal sense, but in the human sense. It meant that what had been done to her was not only going to cost Derek and Charlotte their money and their reputations, it was going to cost them more than that. It was going to cost them the thing that people like Derek Cross, people who had always moved through the world with the confidence of those who believe the rules don't fully apply to them, valued most, their freedom. Sylvio leaned toward her. The criminal referral is significant, he said quietly. It changes the downstream legal landscape considerably. I know, she said. How are you? She thought about the 7 minutes she hadn't known about, the hospitalization option, the deliberate clinical language of two people discussing how to erase her from her own life. She thought about the notepad in her jacket pocket, the trip to Maine, the phone call to Nina, the bed that was hers. She turned to look at Sylvio Reed, this man who had spent 14 months carrying the weight of her truth alongside her, who had walked into that courtroom every single day with the patience and the precision and the absolute conviction that the truth was worth waiting for. And she said, I'm okay. He looked at her for a moment. Then, for what it's worth, I've been doing this for 26 years. In 26 years, I've seen a lot of people in your position, a lot of people who had every right to fall apart, and some of them did, and some of them didn't. He paused. You are the steadiest person I have ever represented. She looked at him steadily. I had to be, she said. There was no other option. There's always another option, he said. Most people take it. The courtroom was beginning to empty. People were moving, talking, the normal human bustle of a room returning to ordinary life after something extraordinary has passed through it. Laura watched the movement without joining it yet. She sat for a moment longer at the plaintiff's table, the last time she would sit here, the last time this particular space would be the center of anything related to her life. And she looked at the room. Empty chairs, a cleared evidence table, the audio system disconnected and dark. She thought about a kitchen floor 11 months ago, a small device held to her ear in a trembling hand. The first time she had heard Derek's voice say the things that would eventually be heard by 12 people who held her future in their hands. She had made one choice in that moment, to stand up off that floor and make a phone call and fight. It had cost her 14 months of her life. It had cost her sleep and health and professional standing, and the last remaining illusions she had carried about the man she had loved. But she was still here, standing, with the truth confirmed and the record set, and the future open in front of her in a way it hadn't been for a very long time. She picked up her bag. She stood. She walked out of courtroom 14 without looking back. In the hallway, the light was ordinary, and the air smelled like the same courthouse air it always smelled like, paper and coffee, and the particular institutional neutral of a public building. People were moving past her in both directions, absorbed in their own business, their own days, their own ordinary lives. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't dialed in 2 years. It rang 3 times. Nina's voice. "Hello?" "It's Laura," she said. A pause. Then, warmly, immediately, the way that real friendships survive long absences. "Laura, oh my God. Laura, how are you?" She stood in the hallway outside courtroom 14 with the ordinary light of a Thursday afternoon falling through the high windows, and she thought about everything that had brought her to this exact moment. And she said, "I'm going to be okay. I really think I'm going to be okay." She paused. "I wanted to call you first." Nina had driven from Milwaukee without being asked. That was the thing about real friendship, the kind that survives years of silence and distance, and the specific shame that comes from letting someone see how far you've fallen. It doesn't wait to be invited. Laura had called from the courthouse hallway on a Thursday afternoon, and by Friday morning, Nina Reyes was sitting across from her at a corner table in the hotel restaurant with 2 cups of coffee between them and the kind of expression on her face that required no words to translate. "You look different," Nina said. Different how? Mina considered it carefully. She had always been precise with language, which was one of the things Laura had always valued about her. "Like someone who just put down something very heavy," she said. "Like you can feel your own arms again." Laura looked at her coffee cup. "That's exactly what it feels like," she said quietly. They sat together for 2 hours that morning, and they talked. Not about the trial mostly, because the trial had been everywhere in the media for 4 days, and Nina had followed it, and there wasn't much to explain. They talked about the years before. The company, in its early days, when Laura had operated out of a spare bedroom in her apartment with a second-hand server and a vision so specific and so stubborn that the few people she had shared it with had looked at her with the particular mix of admiration and doubt that is reserved for people who might either be visionaries or simply crazy. Nina had been one of the people she had told. Nina had been one of the people who had looked at her and said, "I think you can do this." "I should have called you sooner," Laura said. "When things started going wrong, I was too ashamed." "I know," Nina said. "I figured that was it. I didn't push because I thought you needed space. In retrospect, I think we both made the wrong call." "Yeah," Laura set her cup down. "We did." Nina reached across the table and put her hand briefly over Laura's. Not dramatic, not prolonged, just present, the way real comfort works. Not loud, not performed, just there. "What happens now?" Nina asked. Laura had been thinking about that question for 4 days. Not in the vague way she had thought about it during the trial, the trip to Maine, the list in the hotel notepad, but in the specific, practical, structural way that her mind worked when it was finally free to work clearly again. "The criminal proceedings are going to take time," she said. "The DA's office has the referral now. There's a separate civil damages hearing to quantify the financial award. Derek's attorneys are going to delay everything they can delay, because that's what attorneys do when the ground is bad and stalling is the only remaining option." She paused. "But the verdict is real. The record is set. Whatever they do next happens on ground that I control." "And cross-analytics?" Laura looked at her. "That's the next fight." It was the fight she had been building toward since the morning she had stood up off the kitchen floor. Not just the verdict. The verdict was justice, or the beginning of it. But the company was something else. The company was 20 years of her life, and it had been used as a weapon against her, and she intended to take it back. 3 days after the verdict, Sylvio called with news. She was in the hotel still. She had not yet decided where she was going next, which felt like a freedom she was still learning to use, when her phone rang at 8 in the morning and Sylvio's voice came through with an edge of controlled intensity that she recognized immediately as his version of excitement. Derek filed a motion overnight to challenge the verdict, he said. On what grounds? Procedural. He's arguing that Charlotte's allocution, her statement to the court, was improperly admitted and prejudiced the jury. He's also arguing that the additional 7 minutes of the recording played during deliberations constituted new evidence that the defense was not given adequate opportunity to address. Laura sat up straighter. Can either of those arguments succeed? The allocution argument is weak. Moore allowed it with proper discretion, and Charlotte spoke under oath. The recording argument is slightly stronger, technically, because the additional portions were heard by the jury outside the presence of counsel in the traditional examination context. He paused. But here's what I think Derek is actually doing. Tell me. He's not trying to win the motion. He knows it's a long shot. What he's doing is creating delay and appellate record. He's building a paper trail for the next 18 months that complicates the damages hearing, complicates the criminal referral timeline, complicates the asset freeze. A pause. He's going to try to make this expensive enough and complicated enough that at some point you decide to settle for less than you should get. Laura was quiet for a moment. She looked out the window at the city, which was going about its ordinary business under a gray March sky. He's known me for 23 years, she said finally. Does he genuinely believe that strategy is going to work on me? A brief silence. Then Sylvio said, with something in his voice that was almost a laugh, I think after the last 4 days he should know better, but desperate people don't always think clearly. What do we do? We respond to the motion with everything we have, quickly and completely, and we don't give him an inch. And then we file the damages brief on the original schedule. We don't let him reset the clock. Do it, she said. She heard him write something. There's one more thing, he said, and his tone shifted slightly. Not darker, but more careful. I got a call this morning from the DA's office. They're moving faster than I expected on the criminal side. They want to speak with you as early as next week. The weight of that landed differently than she expected. The civil trial had been hers. Her fight, her evidence, her endurance. The criminal proceedings were something larger, something that moved through a system she didn't fully control, that had its own velocity and its own logic. Of course, she said, whatever they need. It's going to get complicated before it gets simple, Sylvio said. I want you to know that going in. It's been complicated for 14 months, she said. I can handle more complicated. She hung up the phone and sat for a moment, with the particular feeling of a person who has won one battle and is already standing at the edge of the next one. Not afraid, just clear-eyed about the distance still to cover. The damages hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the intervening weeks, Laura moved. Not to Maine yet. That was still waiting for her. That stretch of coast, that specific solitude, but out of the hotel and into a furnished apartment on the north side of the city that belonged entirely to her, that no one else had a key to, where nothing in the kitchen had been touched by anyone but her. The first night she slept there, she slept 9 hours straight, which was more than she had slept in a single night in over a year. She woke up at 7:15 and lay in the quiet of the room for a long time before getting up, simply because she could. She began going back to the office in the 3rd week, not to cross analytics. That situation was still legally complicated, the board navigating the fallout from the verdict with the careful institutional caution of people who had bet on the wrong outcome and were adjusting, but to a shared office space downtown where she had rented a desk and began working on what came next. Because there was a next. There had always been a next. That was the thing about being a builder. The impulse didn't stop because someone had tried to take what you built. It recalibrated. It looked at the available materials and it started again. She was meeting with a former cross-analytics client, a mid-sized logistics firm whose CFO, a sharp woman named Diane Marsh, had been one of the first to distance herself from Laura during the media storm of the trial. when Diane said something that stopped the conversation. They were sitting in a conference room on the 14th floor, and Diane was talking about the data migration project that had stalled during the trial period. And she stopped mid-sentence and said, "I need to say something. Off the record or on the record, whatever you prefer." Laura waited. "When all of this started, the stories about you, the questions about your stability, I pulled back," Diane said. "We pulled back. The board made a decision based on the public narrative, and I went along with it. And I've thought about that a lot in the last 2 weeks." She looked directly at Laura. "It was wrong. We should have asked questions instead of running." Laura held her gaze. "Yes," she said simply, "you should have." Diane nodded. "I know. I'm saying it plainly because I think you deserve plain." She paused. "I'd like to talk about what a new engagement would look like, if you're open to it." It was not an apology, exactly. It was something more useful than an apology. It was a reckoning, the specific kind that happens when people who made the convenient choice are confronted with the actual cost of convenience and choose to do something about it rather than simply feel bad. Laura respected it for what it was. "I'm open to it," she said. Diane Marsh was the first. She was not the last. In the 4th week after the verdict, Conrad Walsh filed the expected challenge to Judge Moore's handling of Charlotte's allocution. Moore's written response, 16 pages, methodical and precise, arrived 8 days later and denied the challenge on every point with the kind of judicial language that made it clear the motion had not impressed her. Derek's timeline for disruption was not proceeding the way he had planned. In the 5th week, something happened that nobody had planned for. Charlotte Vane called Sylvio Reed's office, not through her attorney, directly. She left a voicemail on the main line at 8:40 in the morning on a Tuesday, and when Sylvio's assistant flagged it and brought it to him, he called Laura before he did anything else. "She called me," he said. "A beat. Charlotte?" "She left a message. She wants to talk, not to negotiate. She was very specific about that. She said she has additional information that she believes is relevant to the criminal proceedings, and she wants to cooperate with the DA's office." He paused. "She wants to know if you have any objection to her providing that cooperation." Laura sat with this for a long moment. Why would Charlotte call Sylvio instead of going directly to the DA? Because she wanted Laura to know first. Because despite everything, the poisoning, the conspiracy, the 2.5 years of calculated betrayal, Charlotte Vane apparently felt, on some level, that she owed Laura the courtesy of not blindsiding her. Or, perhaps Laura thought, Charlotte understood something more practical, that the path through what was coming next was significantly less navigable without Laura's implicit tolerance of her cooperation. That the woman she had wronged had more power over her future than any attorney. "Tell her to call the DA's office," Laura said finally. "Whatever she knows, they need to hear it. I don't have any objection." A pause. "That's generous." "It's not generous," Laura said. "It's practical. Whatever information she has that helps the case against Derek, I want that information in front of the prosecutors. Whatever happens to Charlotte after that is between her and the court." She stopped. She stood up and told the truth when she didn't have to. "I'm not going to block her from doing it again." Sylvio was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "I'll relay the message." The damages hearing arrived on a Thursday morning 6 weeks after the verdict, and courtroom 14 felt different from the last time Laura had sat in it. Smaller somehow, less charged. The life-or-death quality of the trial had given way to something that was still important, but less immediate. The work of quantifying what had been done, assigning numbers to harm, translating 2 years of systematic destruction into the language of financial compensation. Foster Hale was not there. Conrad Walsh was, flanked now by a third attorney from his firm, a woman specializing in damages litigation. Derek sat between them in his same charcoal suit, but he looked like a man wearing a costume. The clothes still fit, but the person inside them had contracted somehow. Laura sat beside Sylvio and watched Gerald Park return to the stand. Park had spent 6 weeks preparing a damages analysis that was, in Sylvio's words, the most thorough document of its kind he had ever reviewed. It ran to 240 pages and contained 14 separate financial models, each one addressing a different component of the harm: the diverted income, the devalued assets, the professional reputation damage quantified through lost contracts and dissolved partnerships, the medical costs associated with the poisoning treatment and recovery, and what Park called, with precision, the opportunity cost of incapacitation, the deals not made, the expansions not executed, the 2 years of cross-analytics growth that had been deliberately suppressed to make the company easier to acquire. Walsh challenged every number. It was his job, and he did it competently. But Gerald Park had spent 23 years building analyses that could withstand exactly this kind of challenge, and he absorbed Walsh's attacks with the same equanimity he had brought to the first day of testimony. He did not retreat from a single figure. When the session broke for lunch, Walsh approached Sylvio in the hallway. Laura was 3 feet away and heard everything. "My client wants to discuss settlement," Walsh said. Sylvio looked at him for a moment. "During an active damages hearing. The numbers on the table are going to be difficult for the court to award in full. The numbers on the table are supported by 240 pages of financial analysis," Sylvio said pleasantly. "Your client had 2 years to not poison his wife. He made his choices." Walsh kept his voice level. "A settlement gives both parties certainty." "My client has certainty," Sylvio said. "She has a verdict." He glanced briefly at Laura, who was standing with her arms folded, watching Walsh with the patient expression of someone who has heard this exact pitch before and knows precisely what it is worth. "We're not interested in settlement at this stage, Counselor." Walsh looked at Laura directly. "Ms. Cross, this process is going to take months. There will be appeals. Derek has resources, and he will use them." "Mr. Walsh," Laura said, and her voice was very quiet and very steady. "Your client tried to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized so he could take $47 million that I built. He spent 2 years systematically poisoning me. He is now looking at criminal charges that carry real prison time." She looked at Walsh with the specific clarity of a person who has been through the worst of it and come out the other side. "There is no number he can put on the table today that accounts for that. So no, we're not interested." Walsh said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded once and walked away. Sylvio looked at Laura. "Too harsh?" she asked. "Not even close," he said. The damages hearing concluded on the second day with Judge Moore taking the quantification question under submission, which meant she would issue a written ruling rather than a courtroom decision, a process that typically took several weeks. During that waiting period, the criminal proceedings began to accelerate in ways that pulled focus from the civil case and created a new layer of urgency. The DA's office, acting on the referral and on whatever Charlotte Vane had provided in her cooperation, filed criminal charges against Derek Cross in the 5th week after the damages hearing. The charges were substantial: conspiracy to commit fraud, administration of a controlled substance without consent, and criminal attempt, which addressed the planned institutionalization that the 7 additional minutes of recording had documented. Each charge carried real exposure. Taken together, they represented the kind of legal jeopardy that money and attorneys could slow but could not ultimately prevent, because the evidence was what it was, and it was not going away. Derek's response to the criminal charges was to request bail, granted, with conditions, and to hire yet another attorney, this one a former federal prosecutor who had built his career on high-profile criminal defense. His name was Bernard Cast, and he was expensive and experienced and widely regarded as one of the best in the city. His involvement signaled something that Sylvio confirmed when he called Laura with the news. "Cast doesn't take cases he thinks are unwinnable," Sylvio said, which tells us either that Derek genuinely believes he has a path or that he's paying for psychological comfort as much as legal strategy. "Which do you think it is?" A pause. "The second one," Sylvio said. "But I've been wrong before. Charlotte, through her cooperation agreement with the DA's office, had provided something that neither Laura nor Sylvio had known existed. A series of emails sent through an encrypted platform that Charlotte had backed up without Derek's knowledge, in which Derek had laid out the entire plan in writing. Not the vague language of the recorded conversations, but specific and operational. Purchase orders, timelines, the name of the physician he had been attempting to bribe to provide the competency documentation, the law firm he had pre-retained to execute the asset transfer. The emails were dated. They were authenticated. They were devastating. Sylvio called Laura when the document disclosure came through from the DA's office. His voice had the quality of controlled intensity she had come to associate with genuinely significant developments. Charlotte backed up the emails, he said. She kept copies on a drive stored at her sister's apartment. A brief pause. Laura, she kept them from the beginning. She kept them the entire time. Laura sat with this information. She thought about Charlotte Vane, 29 years old, in love with the wrong person, making catastrophically wrong choices, and knowing they were wrong in some part of herself even while she made them. Keeping copies of the evidence, maintaining a record. Some corner of Charlotte's conscience had been paying attention even when the rest of her wasn't. She protected herself, Laura said finally. Maybe, Sylvio said. Or maybe she protected you. I honestly can't tell which. Does it matter? He thought about it. No, he said. The emails exist either way. With the email evidence added to the recording, the toxicology analysis, the financial records, and Charlotte's cooperation, Bernard Cast found himself holding a case that was not winnable. Not in the way that legal cases have degrees of winnability. This was a case where the evidence had reached a kind of critical mass, the weight of it simply too great for any strategy to lift, regardless of the attorney behind it. Derek Cross pled guilty on a Tuesday morning in October, 7 months after the verdict. Laura was not in the courtroom for the plea. She was in Maine. She had gone 2 weeks earlier, finally, after 9 months of waiting, after putting it on a list and folding the list in her pocket and carrying it through every hard day that followed. She had driven up from Boston on a Thursday afternoon and found the stretch of coast she remembered from childhood, which was smaller than memory had made it, but more beautiful. And she had rented a small house 200 yards from the water, and she had stayed for 12 days. On the morning of Derek's plea, she was sitting on the deck of the rental house with her phone in her hand and a cup of coffee going cold beside her. And Sylvio called her at 9:17 and said he pled guilty on all counts. She looked at the water. Sentencing is in 8 weeks, Sylvio continued. Cast is going to argue for reduced time based on the guilty plea and Derek's lack of prior record. The DA is going to push for the upper range. I'll keep you informed. What's the likely outcome, she asked. 7 to 10 years. With good behavior, probably 6. A pause. He'll be in his mid-50s when he gets out. Everything financial has been addressed through the civil judgment and the criminal restitution order. Laura, his voice shifted slightly. It's over, or close enough to over that the remaining steps are formalities. She breathed. The water was gray and moving and completely indifferent to everything that had happened over the last 14 months, which was exactly what she needed it to be. Thank you, Sylvio, she said, and meant it in a way that the words couldn't fully carry. Thank you for everything. You did the hard part, he said. You're the one who stood up off the floor. After she hung up, she sat for a long time without moving. She thought about the kitchen floor, which felt like a different lifetime now, a version of herself that was still real, still part of her, but no longer the current chapter. She thought about the 14 months of steadiness it had required to get from that floor to this morning, and she thought about the specific cost of that steadiness, the sleep lost, the professional damage absorbed, the loneliness of carrying a truth that no one else could see yet. She thought about 23 years of a marriage that had started as something real and had, at some point she couldn't precisely identify, become something else entirely. She had spent time, in the early months, trying to locate the exact moment when Derek had decided she was a resource to be managed, rather than a person to be loved. She had stopped looking for that moment. The looking didn't help. The answer, even if she found it, would change nothing. What she knew was this: she had built something. Someone had tried to take it from her and had failed, and she was still here. She opened her phone and called Nina. "He pled," she said when Nina picked up. Nina's intake of breath was audible. "All counts?" "All counts." A pause filled with everything that didn't need to be said. Then Nina said, "How are you feeling?" Laura looked at the water, the gray morning light on it, the way it moved without caring about any of it, which was somehow profoundly comforting. "I'm going to rebuild the company," she said. "I've been making calls for 2 months. Diane Marsh is already signed. There are 3 others in conversation. The data analytics market shifted while I was fighting this thing, and I can see exactly where the gaps are and exactly what I want to build to fill them." She paused. "I'm going to call it something different, not cross-analytics, something new." "What are you going to call it?" She thought about it, about a spare bedroom and a second-hand server and a vision so stubborn it had survived everything that had been thrown at it. "I don't know yet," she said, "but something that's mine, just mine." Nina was quiet for a moment. Then, with the warmth of a person who had known her since before the company and the marriage and all of it, "You're going to be okay, Laura." "I know," she said. And she did know. Not as a hope, not as a thing she was telling herself to get through a hard morning, but as a simple, unambiguous fact. "I know I am." 6 weeks later, Judge Moore issued the written damages ruling. The total award was $31 million in compensatory damages and $14 million in punitive damages. $45 million, which fell one figure short of the full 47 that Gerald Park's analysis had supported, but which Sylvio said was one of the largest civil verdicts in a case of this kind that he had seen in 26 years of practice. The ruling was 63 pages long, and it laid out in the precise and unsparing language of a judge who had watched every moment of the proceedings exactly what had been done to Laura Cross and exactly why it warranted what the court had awarded. Laura read the ruling at her desk in the new office space, not the shared space downtown, but her own, 4 rooms on the 7th floor of a building she had just signed a lease on, with her name on the door and nobody else's. She read all 63 pages. She did not rush through them. She read every word. When she was finished, she put the ruling down on her desk, and she sat in the quiet of her own office for a long time. Then she picked up a pen and opened a notebook, not the hotel notepad with the list, which she had kept but which was now complete, every item on it checked off. And she wrote at the top of the first page the name she had decided on for the new company. She had come up with it the previous week at 2 a.m, sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment that belonged only to her. And the moment it came to her, she had known it was right. It was simple. It was direct. It said exactly what she intended. She wrote it down and looked at it and nodded once. Then she picked up her phone and started making calls, because Laura Cross had never been a woman who waited for permission to begin, and she was not about to start now.